Welcome to the Echoes of Ihsan podcast. Today we're taking a deep dive into a topic from the Muwatta Imam Malik. It's book 44, and it's about,
The Oath of Qasama.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty remarkable system when you think about
Oh,
it.
yeah.
It really gives us some insight into how Islamic jurisprudence approached murder cases,
Yeah.
especially when there wasn't, a clear-cut eyewitness or, like we think about today, DNA evidence or fingerprints, CCTV footage,
Well, yeah.
nothing like that.
So we're talking way back.
Way back, exactly.
Okay, so can you explain, like, just for our listeners, like, what is this Qasama thing?
Sure. It's basically, at its core, a way to handle murder cases where clear evidence was lacking. So what it involved was a group of people, typically the victim's family, swearing these solemn oaths, asserting their belief that the accused person was guilty. And these oaths were very significant. They weren't just casual statements. They were invoking divine judgment. And they carried serious consequences if they were sworn falsely.
Oh, wow. So invoking the divine right there in a legal setting, that's pretty intense. Well, the Muwatta actually gives us a really vivid historical example of this Qasama in action. And it involves a murder in Khaybar
Oh, yeah.
during the time of the Prophet Muhammad.
That's right.
So can you kind of walk us through that story?
Yeah, so this case, it's really fascinating because it highlights the ethical and legal complexities that often came with Qasama. So there's this man named Abdullah ibn Sal, and he travels to Khaybar, and tragically, he ends up dead. Now, his body was found in a well, or maybe it was a spring. The sources aren't totally clear on the exact location, but suspicion falls upon the Jewish community that's residing in Khaybar at the time.
So it's a real whodunit, like a historical murder mystery.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. So how did they apply this Qasama to that specific situation?
So Abdullah's brother shows up, understandably distraught, and demands justice. And he accuses the Jewish community of murdering his brother. Now, you have to remember, this is a society where kinship ties are incredibly strong, and honor is super important. So the death of Abdullah isn't just a personal tragedy, it's something that could very easily trigger a full-blown conflict between these groups.
Oh, wow. So you can really feel the tension.
Absolutely, it's a very tense situation.
Things are about to explode.
It really could go either way.
So how did they manage to de-escalate the situation?
That's where the Prophet Muhammad steps in. He's presented with this incredibly volatile situation, and he has to find a solution that upholds justice, but also prevents more bloodshed. So, according to the Muwatta, he offers the accusers, which is Abdullah's family, two options.
Okay, so two options. Let's go through these options. What were they?
Okay, so the first option was to swear the Qasama oaths. Now, this involved a specific number of oaths. We'll get into the details a bit later. But if they were successful in swearing these oaths, they could then demand blood money from the accused community.
Okay.
And blood money, also known as diya,
Oh, right.
is a key concept in Islamic law. And it's basically financial compensation paid to the victim's family as a form of reparation.
Okay, so it's a way of acknowledging that harm has been done.
Yeah.
And offering some form of, like, recompense, even if it can't bring the person back.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the first option. What was the second option?
So the second option was a lot more drastic. They could actually demand war.
Wow.
And if you remember, this is a time when intertribal warfare was not uncommon. So if the accusers felt they couldn't get justice through the Qasama oaths, they had the right to resort to force.
So it's like they're really weighing these options.
It's a huge decision, absolutely.
Seeking justice.
Yeah,
And potentially, starting a war and even more bloodshed.
a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, wow. So what did they choose? What did Abdullah's family choose?
So they actually refused to swear the Qasama oaths. And there were a couple of reasons for this.
Yeah.
Firstly, they hadn't actually witnessed the murder,
Ah,
so they were very hesitant to swear oaths based solely on suspicion.
makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. And then secondly, they weren't sure about accepting oaths from non-Muslims,
Oh, interesting.
which kind of reflects the social and religious dynamics of the time.
So they're kind of in a bind.
Yeah,
They can't swear the oath themselves,
right.
but they're not comfortable with the oaths from the other side either.
Yeah, it's a classic deadlock situation.
Old deadlock, yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Faced with this impasse, Prophet Muhammad decides to pay the blood money himself
What?
out of his own personal funds.
Wow, that's incredible.
Which is pretty remarkable.
That's real leadership.
It really is.
He's really committed to peace, it seems like,
Absolutely.
and to justice.
It demonstrates a real willingness to go above and beyond. to find a peaceful resolution to a potentially really explosive situation.
Yeah, wow. So this story gives us a really interesting look at Qasama being applied in the real world, you know?
It does. It really brings it to life.
But what about the standard procedure? Like, how did this oath-taking system actually work?
Okay, so in a standard Qasama case, there was a set procedure. If a murder took place and there was no clear evidence, the people who were claiming blood vengeance, usually the victim's closest male relatives, had to collectively swear 50 oaths.
50 oaths, 50 oaths.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a serious commitment.
What did those oaths involve? What were they actually saying? So these oaths were highly specific, carefully worded, and they were delivered in a very solemn manner to kind of underscore the gravity of the situation. Essentially, they were declaring that they believed that the accused was responsible for the death. And it wasn't about proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in the way that we might think about it today. It was more about expressing a sincere conviction based on the information that was available.
Okay, so it's like formalizing their suspicion within this legal framework.
Exactly.
Okay, so they swear the 50 oaths. Then what happens?
Then they had two choices.
Okay.
They could demand the payment of blood money, or they could demand the execution of the accused.
It's two very different paths.
Yeah, it really highlights the seriousness of taking a life.
Wow.
And the need for, a strong deterrent.
So it's the accusers who get to choose.
That's right.
Wow.
It gives them a certain amount of power in the situation.
Yeah, so it's like a balance between like retribution, wanting punishment, and the possibility of some kind of reconciliation through that financial compensation.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What if the accusers refuse to swear, like we saw with Abdullah's family?
Right. So in those cases, the burden of proof would shift to the accused. They then had the right to swear 50 oaths themselves, basically proclaiming their innocence and clearing their name.
So it's like a back and forth, this legal battle of oaths almost.
Exactly. A very high-stakes situation.
Very high stakes. Was there any limit on how many people could be punished because of Qasama?
Yeah, so there was a very important safeguard built into the system. Even if the accusers successfully swore those 50 oaths, only one person could be executed based on Qasama.
Oh, that's interesting.
It was to prevent excessive punishment
Okay.
and make sure that the punishment was proportional.
Okay, so it wasn't about wiping out a whole group or something like that.
Right. It was about making sure that justice was served, but it was also about preventing things from spiraling out of control.
So even in the face of this loss, this tragedy, there's still these checks and balances in place.
Absolutely.
That's fascinating. Why did they have this whole system of oaths in the first place? It seems, it seems a little strange to us today to base these big decisions on just someone saying something.
Well, if you think about it, this is long before forensic science or fingerprinting or DNA analysis. Proving murder, especially if it was done in secret, was really, really difficult.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so Qasama was a way to deal with that challenge, but it was also a way to make sure that there were consequences for taking a life unjustly. It was designed for a world where certainty was really hard to come by, and they had to rely on other methods to try to achieve justice.
So the legal system really adapting to what was possible at the time.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Was it just about practicality, though? Or were there deeper reasons for this system?
Oh, absolutely. There were deeper principles at play here. Qasama wasn't just this procedural thing. It was actually rooted in a very profound respect for human life.
Oh, wow.
And a desire to create a society where violence was discouraged.
So requiring these oaths, invoking the divine, is really bringing a strong moral dimension into the legal process.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, and it wasn't just about individuals either, right?
Right.
It was with the community.
It really underscored this concept of communal responsibility.
So how did that work?
Well, remember that the oaths were often sworn not by just one person, but by a group. The victim's family or their clan.
Right. We talked about that. So it was a way for the community to step up and make sure that justice was done.
Yeah.
But also to help prevent violence happening in the first place.
That's right.
Because if someone was killed,
it was on them to either prove guilt
or to clear the name of the accused.
Exactly.
So it's really interesting. It's not just about resolving a specific case.
It's much bigger than that.
It's about maintaining the peace of the community.
It's about the fabric of the society.
Wow, that's really insightful. I'm curious, did it say anything about different types of cases and how Qasama was used?
Yeah, there are some important distinctions. For example, it points out the difference between financial disputes and murder cases.
Oh, interesting. Why was that distinction important?
Well, think about it. Back then, financial matters were usually conducted out in the open, marketplaces, public settings.
Okay.
There were usually witnesses around and sometimes even written agreements or records.
Right.
But murder usually happened in secret. It's a crime that's hidden.
Right, yeah.
So it's much harder to prove.
Makes sense. So Qasama was a way of dealing with that challenge.
Exactly.
Recognizing that you can't always approach things in the same way.
Yeah. Different crimes require different approaches.
That's fascinating. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've gone from that dramatic story in Khaybar to like the nitty-gritty of how this oath-taking worked.
It's a fascinating system.
It really is. But I think we should take a quick break. And when we come back, we can dive into some more specific examples, like who could participate in Qasama and how the system worked with different groups within society.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it. As we're going through all this, it's really interesting to see how the Muwatta, it tries to find that balance between wanting some kind of retribution, but also preventing more violence from happening. It's not just about punishing someone. It's about finding a way to resolve things and keep the peace.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Seems like a tough thing to do, especially with something as emotional as murder.
Yeah.
How did they manage that? Were there specific things built into the system
to
help with that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One important thing was that the accusers could choose to take blood money instead of going for execution.
Right.
Remember, if they swore the oaths, they had that option.
Okay.
They could demand the payment. Or they could demand the punishment.
So it's not just like all or nothing.
Right. It wasn't just about revenge.
There was a way to kind of find some healing.
Yeah, exactly.
Even after something so terrible.
And that idea of choosing between those two things, retribution or reconciliation, it's a big part of Islamic teachings.
Right.
It's about justice, but it's also about forgiveness.
It's interesting how that shows up in the actual laws.
Yeah, it's not just a bunch of rules.
It's about these really deep human emotions.
It is, yeah.
Trying to find that balance, find peace.
In Qasama, remember, it wasn't just one person making the decision.
Right.
It was the whole community, the family, or the clan.
We were talking about that before, and that really made them responsible for keeping things peaceful.
Exactly.
But how did that actually work in real life?
Imagine, one tribe member is killed, and they think it was someone from another tribe. The family is grieving, they're angry, they want justice. But instead of just going straight to violence, they have to go through this process, gathering 50 people from their own community to swear those oaths.
So they have to slow down, think about it.
Yeah, they have to involve everyone.
It's not just about acting on emotion.
Right, exactly.
They have to be careful.
It's a serious decision.
And what about false accusations? What if people lied because they had a grudge?
That's a good question. The system really depended on people being honest. They had to be afraid of what would happen if they lied.
Right. Divine judgment, like you said before.
And there was also the social pressure.
Right.
If you lied, it would hurt your reputation. And your families, too.
So there were real consequences.
Oh, yeah.
And the accused could also swear oaths.
That's right. They had a chance to defend themselves.
So it wasn't one-sided.
It was about trying to be fair.
Even though it all came down to oaths.
And that's what makes Qasama so interesting. It was about human nature, the limits of what we can know, and how to find that balance between punishing and preserving the peace.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the Muwatta talks about who could actually take part in this Qasama.
Oh.
Were there rules about that?
Definitely. The rules were based on how society worked back then. For instance, in cases of intentional murder, when it was clear it was on purpose, only men who were blood relatives of the victim could swear the oaths.
Okay, so really specific. Why was it just men?
Well, back then, men were seen as the protectors. They were responsible for their family's honor and for getting justice if someone was wronged.
So it's because society was patriarchal back then?
Yeah, you could say that.
Women didn't have the same power?
But it wasn't always like that. For example, if it was manslaughter, which means the killing wasn't on purpose, women could take part.
Oh, that's interesting. Why was there a difference?
It seems like women weren't given the same role when it came to revenge.
Okay.
But they still had a right to seek justice if someone was killed, especially if it was an accident.
So it's more complicated than just saying women were excluded.
Yeah, there are definitely nuances.
There were times when their participation was important, necessary.
Yeah.
So even though the system reflected the way society was,
Right.
it also had parts that recognized women's rights. And that's really important to remember.
I think so too.
It's not always black and white.
And that's what the Muwatta shows us.
Yeah.
It gives us all these details,
Yeah.
and it helps us understand how things really worked.
Wow. So the Muwatta doesn't just say who can participate.
Right.
It also talks about how the oaths and the blood money were divided up.
Oh, yeah, it was a very detailed system.
So it was fair to everyone involved.
And that's where inheritance comes in.
Okay.
The blood money, it was treated like part of the deceased's property.
Okay.
And it was divided according to Islamic inheritance laws.
So there were specific rules about who got what.
Yeah, it wasn't just random.
And did those laws include women? Or were they left out, like in some other societies?
This is an important point. The female relatives who would normally inherit, they also got a share of the blood money.
So daughters, sisters, mothers.
Yeah, all of them.
They received what they were supposed to.
According to the law.
That's really significant. It means that even in a situation like this, with murder and all that.
Islamic law still protected women's right to inherit.
Wow.
It recognized that they were part of the family.
And that they should be compensated.
Yeah, they had a financial stake.
It's amazing how much detail the Muwatta gives us.
It really helps us understand the complexity of the situation.
It challenges those assumptions we might have.
Yeah, it's not always what we expect.
So we've been focusing on cases with free people.
Right.
But the Muwatta also talks about cases with slaves.
Yeah, that's where it gets more complicated.
It reflects that time in history.
It does. Slavery was a reality then.
And the law had to deal with that.
It's a tough topic, but we have to understand it.
Absolutely.
Mm.
So what happened if a slave was injured? Was it the same process as with free people?
Actually, it was different. The Muwatta says that if a slave was hurt, the master could get compensated.
Okay.
But they didn't have to do the whole Qasama thing
Okay.
with 50 people swearing oaths.
So it was simpler.
Yeah, it was.
What's the master have to do?
They just needed one witness, and they had to swear one oath themselves.
So much less than for a free person.
Exactly.
It seems like the slave's life wasn't as important.
That's true, and it reflects the power dynamics of that time.
It's uncomfortable to think about,
It is.
but we have to acknowledge it.
The Muwatta shows us that slaves didn't have the same rights.
Even though it did address when they were harmed.
It's a reminder that even systems trying to be fair,
Yeah.
they operate within their own time and place.
And sometimes that time and place is just not fair.
Yeah, that's right.
We have to learn from that.
The Muwatta gives us a glimpse into that evolution of law. It shows how things have changed.
And how far we still need to go.
That's a really good point.
So we've talked about a lot.
The balance between punishment and peace.
Communal responsibility.
Yeah.
Who could be part of Qasama?
And how it worked with slaves.
It's a lot to think about.
Qasama is a really interesting example of how Islamic law approached justice. It recognized how complicated human nature is and how hard it is to know things, for sure.
And it still tried to be fair.
Even in those difficult situations. It's interesting, what the Muwatta says about cases where a slave was actually killed.
Right. We were talking about injuries. What about death? Could the master still get something?
Yeah.
Or use that Qasama system?
This is where things are different. The Muwatta, it says there's no Qasama if a slave is killed.
Oh, so the master can't gather people to swear oaths? Like
No.
they would if it was a free person?
Exactly. It's a whole different process.
Okay.
Like the master, they have to prove it.
Prove it.
Yeah, like show real evidence. Or have a witness who saw what happened.
They can't just rely on oaths this time.
Right. They need something more concrete.
Wow.
And this shows us, again, how different things were for slaves.
It's like their lives weren't valued the same.
That's a tough thing to think about.
It is. It's a really harsh reality.
But the Muwatta, it reflects what was happening in society back then.
It's a reminder of those injustices.
Yeah.
It's amazing how these ancient practices,
Qasama.
they still make us think about the big questions, even today.
It's true. Evidence, proof, responsibility, punishment, reconciliation. These are all things we're still dealing with.
And the Muwatta gives us this window into the past.
Yeah, a different time and place.
But trying to deal with the same issues.
It's like a mirror.
Exactly. A legal mirror.
Trying to find justice, trying to prevent violence, trying to protect life.
And it's interesting how the logic behind Qasama, it still feels relevant.
It does, in a way.
Even though our legal systems are so different now.
They've evolved, yeah.
But we still want fairness. A system that works.
And Qasama, it shows us one way that people tried to do that.
Even with its flaws.
Even with the limitations.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Qasama, what's the main thing you hope people take away from this?
I think the most important thing is that Qasama, it really shows us this deep respect for life and a real commitment to finding justice. Even when it was really hard to do, it recognized that we don't always know everything. But we still have to try to be fair. We have to hold each other accountable, and we have to work together as a community.
That's beautifully said. And for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more, definitely check out the Muwatta Imam Malik. Read about Islamic legal history, see how it compares to other systems.
It's fascinating stuff.
It is.
It can teach us so much about how to build a better future.
I agree. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Oath of Qasama. We'll see you next time for another exploration of knowledge and insight.